Yeah. All right, everyone, welcome. My name's Ellie Harris. I'm part of our People and Culture group. I'm in Irvine, California with Dr. Iris Furstenberg. This is our third Positive Deviant workshop, and we're so happy that you're here attending. We're really happy Dr. Iris Furstenberg has done all three for us, so I'm going to hand it off to her so you guys can hear about bringing the future to the present.
Yes, good morning to all of you. I'm looking out your windows and I'm assuming it's morning for you, wherever you are there. So welcome to the third Positive Deviant workshop. And in this session, we are going to focus on the concept of uncertainty. And the reason we're going to talk about uncertainty is that it is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, obstacle to our ability to create value. When you're thinking about planning or creating strategy for the future, one of the things you have to contend with is knowing that there are things you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And so if we think about our relationship to the future, what happens the deeper we look? Oops, Ellie, something just happened. What happens the deeper we look? If you think about what is Logitech like today, you can pretty much explain the present state. What do you think Logitech will be like a year from now? What will the products be? What will the challenges be? Who will the competitors be? That too, it's only a year out, you pretty much have a feel for that. What's Logitech going to be like 15 years from now? What will the competitive space look like? What products will you be focusing on? As we go deeper into the future, there are many, many more unknowns. And yet, you still have to be thinking about that distance into the future as you begin to plan and deploy resources today. So what we're going to look at is a strategy that I have come to call bringing the future to the present. And the idea is if the future has more uncertainty than today does, if we could somehow pick up that future and bring it, plant it, and look at it, we could surface what is invisible to many of us right now. So how can we essentially surface the invisible and make it visible so that we can create better, more informed plans? That is the idea. And so I'm going to share with you a variety of ways of doing just that, of bringing the future to the present. And I'll share with you a whole slew of stories, many stories that also describe how other people and teams have found ways to bring the future to the present. And then, of course, I'm going to challenge you to think about how you could apply these same strategies to your team, to your team's ability to create value. So I'll start with a story that demonstrates how simple this strategy actually can be. At UCLA, my home university, the business school was constructed about 15 years ago. The university added a new building to the campus. And once the building was up, it's a beautiful building, it's glass and marble, they hired a landscaping team to put the paths and the grass and the flowers and all of the things outside the building. And one of the things that this landscaping team had to think about is where to put the paths that would connect this building with the rest of campus. So of course we need to connect to the parking lot, we need to connect to the library. How do you put paths in? And they had to think about volume, how wide should the paths be? Well, they created a beautiful design. But the design was very curvy. They put a lot of curves in the design. And they did that because they wanted to mimic a creek that we had near the building. So it would be a design echo. Then they opened the building to the users. We came. And when I had to leave the building and get to another part of campus, I don't have time to go to meander around curvy paths. I need the shortest distance. And I'm not alone. Other students, other faculty, speed matters. So we began cutting across the grass. Well, what happens when people start trampling the grass is the grass dies. So within a few weeks, it looks terrible. the university for an entire year played a game with us. We would kill the grass. They would then put barricades up and reseed the grass. As soon as the grass grew, they would take the barricades down, and then we would do it again. So after a year of back and forth like this, they finally gave up, and they put a gravel path across the grass so that at least we wouldn't be killing the grass. But because this is a afterthought, it's like a Band-Aid solution, there's a new problem. The sprinklers are in the wrong place. So you can be walking across this gravel path and get soaked because the sprinklers come on. There used to be grass there, and so it waters the path as well. The University of Stony Brook, a school in New York, did something very different. They decided to bring the future to the present. What did they do differently? After their buildings were constructed, they did not hire a landscape company. They just planted very cheap grass everywhere, and they let the students come. Within about 6 weeks, it was very clear where people wanted to walk. The grass was dead. And as soon as we had one holiday, the students left, the faculty left the campus, then they hired the construction team to come in and pour the concrete where the grass was dead. They paved the paths that the users had already shown them where they wanted to walk. And then they put all the grass and the flowers around those paths. That's a school that doesn't have a problem with people killing the grass. And so if you look at the difference between that school and my university, what that school did is they said our users, our end users, can give us valuable input rather than having us make assumptions and then later get feedback. So that same information, where do people want to walk, you can get it as feedback or you can get it as input. And so if you think about it, bringing the future to the present can hold for perceptions. Whose perceptions do you get late in your processes as feedback that might help you make more informed choices if you could get that same information as input? And it's not limited to customers, by the way. Think about your strategy meetings. For your team to be able to create value, do you ever have to go and engage another group or another part of Logitech and get their buy-in? If you have to go and get buy-in, you've waited too long. Buy-in is risky. You may not get their buy-in. So this is precisely the type of person or group you want to involve early and bring that future into your strategy meetings early on and actually listen to those people. Hear out their concerns so you can build them into your project. It's a concept of build-in rather than buy-in. Build-in is input, buy-in is potentially adversarial feedback. So with that, that's just one question I want you to think about discussing later on with your teams. You do, by the way, have access to a handout either in your emails, Ellie's in their emails or in their...
And in the conference rooms.
Or in your conference rooms, and you'll be able to use that handout later for conversation. So one conversation is, who currently is not part of our strategy meetings that we might want to think about involving earlier so that we can make more informed choices and not just be basing our decisions on assumptions that may not be accurate. We actually discussed this in my last session with you. So those of you who were present in the previous, in the Positive Deviant workshop number 2, we talked about a concept called deliberate chaos. And if you think back to what we talked about in terms of deliberate chaos, perceptions is what that whole concept was about. So deliberate chaos is essentially one way to bring the future to the present. Now, for this engagement with you, I want to talk about 3 additional ways to bring the future to the present. And the first one we'll discuss, I think, is probably the most provocative of all. And I started thinking about what I'm about to tell you after reading a book of science fiction. There's an author by the name of William Gibson. He coined the word cyberspace before any of us had ever seen a computer. So he's a very forward thinker. And in one of his pieces, he wrote the following. He said, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And I thought, that's interesting. And I'll repeat it. He said, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And I really had to think long about what that could mean. Because he's writing science fiction, and I was thinking, is it possible that in the real world, the future is already here in many ways? Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it is already here. It's just not here. It's unevenly distributed. And that could mean that I could potentially go and visit my own future, that Logitech could potentially go and visit Logitech's future. And I want to share with you stories of how people have done that. And I'll start with a personal story, and then I'll share with you a company story of visiting the future. So my oldest daughter was 17 years old. She was in 11th grade. And during the first few weeks of school of that year, she came home very excited. And one day she announces to the family at dinner, "I know what I want to do with my life. I want to be an archaeologist." My husband and I were a bit surprised. We'd never heard any form of interest from her before in anything to do with outdoors or sand. And suddenly archaeology is a passion. So we were kind of curious, where's this coming from? Well, that week, we have a program in the United States called Back to School Night, where parents go in the evening to meet the teachers and learn what the year curriculum will be. So I go to the high school and I walk into the history classroom. Within 10 seconds, I knew where archaeology was coming from. There was a new history teacher. He was probably 28 years old. He was adorable. In fact, he was incredibly handsome. And he was dressed like Indiana Jones. And he had pictures of himself on all the walls, on all these archaeological digs he has apparently gone on. And he has been telling the class stories about his adventures. And when I joke with the other parents, it turns out it's not just my daughter. There's an entire classroom of kids who all want to be archaeologists now. And so, my husband and I were thinking, this can be serious. Because how many people do you know who went off and studied something for all the wrong reasons? And they might have studied for 4 years or 6 years, they get a degree, and then they go into the real world and they're shocked with what they've gotten themselves into. And so we're thinking, can our daughter visit this exotic, adventuresome future that she sees? Well, that summer we found an archaeological dig that was taking teenagers for the experience and was going to be all of July and August in the Sinai Desert. Lucky for us, this was before international cell phones didn't exist. There was no internet connection. She would be gone for those 2 months. And I say we were lucky because when she came back, she was ready to kill us. And she said, "I will never do that again. I need to work in a bank with air conditioning." And that was the end of archaeology. So sometimes visiting your future is to self-correct and to find out that you have perhaps made some misplaced assumptions. Other times, and I have stories of that as well, you actually get more committed. You're actually confirming that what you thought is real, and now you become even more committed. So our daughter managed to visit her future, and the question is, can an entire company visit its own future? So I'm going to share with you a remarkable story of a company that visited its own future, and then I'll ask you, how could Logitech do the same? How could Logitech visit its own future? The company in question is called Cemex, Cement Mexicana. Cemex is a construction company in Mexico. They deliver the ready-mix cement in the trucks to construction sites. And in the mid-90s, right around 1995, this company is about to go out of business, which was quite sad. It was a family-owned company. started in 1906. The grandson is now running the place. And they calculate that they only have cash to last them another 6 months. And they don't know what the problem is. What is going wrong? So they decide to have a very grand conversation. And they brought into the room vendors, suppliers, customers, the drivers of the trucks, the CEO. Everybody is in there talking about what the problems might be. And from all these different vantage points, they were able to see something. They were actually able to surface something that had been invisible to them until that moment. It turned out that their on-time delivery of their products to customers was only 35% of the orders that were placed. I mean, can you imagine if Logitech only delivered on 35% of orders that were placed? It was so bad. Customers were placing multiple orders, hoping at least one truck would show up. And you certainly can't run a business that way. So Cemex recognized that they had to get better at on-time delivery. Sorry, Ellie, could you close the door? I think there's a bit of background noise. So they have to get better at on-time delivery. Well, you're Cemex and it's 1995. You don't know how to do on-time delivery, but who on this planet is already fantastic at on-time delivery? And their first thought was FedEx. Now, will FedEx share their secrets with a cement company from Mexico? You don't know until you ask. And I think what you will find now is that companies have become more and more transparent, more and more open, looking for synergies, looking for ways to help each other. And so FedEx invites them in, and they are astonished at what they are learning about on-time delivery, and they get so excited. They want to go on another visit. Maybe another company can shed new lessons. While they were in the United States, somebody saw an advertisement on TV, and the advertisement said, "We deliver in 30 minutes or it's free." And the company was Domino's Pizza. So they thought, pizza delivery, that's brilliant, because that's a perishable product. We could learn even more about on-time delivery, because our product is also perishable. So they go to Domino's. Domino's welcomes them and invites them in. And from these two visits, they were starting to have really very creative ideas about what they could do differently. And then somebody had an idea for one more visit. Faster than pizza in 30 minutes door to door. When you need a fire truck or you need an ambulance, you don't want them in 30 minutes, you want them now. So they did a bit of research and found that in the United States, in Houston, Texas, they had an average response time of 4 minutes. How do they do that? A 4-minute response time door to door, from the call to delivery. We got to find out how they do it. And from these three very different visits, right? FedEx, pizza, emergency services, they completely revised how they do business. Won't go into the details. Within a few months, they were delivering 98% of their product on time. That's not a little bit better. That's a revolution. And today, Cemex is the world's largest supplier of cement and concrete products. They operate in over 60 countries. Revenues per employee are more than $300,000 annually per employee. It's a remarkably innovative company, but we wouldn't even be here to talk about them if they had not gone to visit the future. Now, interesting. Did they try to go to a competitor to learn what the competition is doing? And the answer is no. Why not go to the competition? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, the competition doesn't want to share their secrets. But even if you could infiltrate, even if you could find out what they're doing, the second reason is more important. It's boring. They're pretty much doing what you're doing. The lessons aren't going to be provocative. If you really want to innovate and shape the future, you've got to be learning from people who don't think like you. So you want to go to outside industries that are as different from what you do as possible. And that's where the real triggers for creative ideas will come from. Another example, and I'll just share with you briefly one more example to show you how far afield you can go to learn interesting lessons. Novartis is a pharmaceutical company, and they have a drug for heart disease. If a patient comes to a hospital and is diagnosed with heart disease, they start using that Novartis product. The issue is that the patients have to continue using the drug even after they are discharged from the hospital. And Novartis wanted a way to track patients and find out how they're using the drug even after they leave the hospital. Well, Novartis had a problem. They don't have a tracking system. They don't know how to track patients. And it turns out hospitals don't have a tracking system either. When you're discharged from the hospital, nobody's following you. So Novartis asked an interesting question. They said, we don't have a tracking system, but what institution might have a tracking system that we could learn from? And their first thought, after a bit of thinking, was the prison system. When prisoners are let out and sent on parole, they are tracked, they are followed. And so they said, let's meet with the prison system and learn how they track people who are on parole. And so they met in Atlanta, Georgia, with the head of the prison system. And while meeting with him, which is provocative, think about that. A pharmaceutical company is going to a prison to learn lessons. While in that meeting, they learned something they didn't even expect to learn. That's the beauty of going on these visits. New ideas will come to you that we weren't even expecting. The warden explained that when people are in prison, we don't want them going out on parole and then committing new crimes and coming back to prison. So this concept of recidivism means people going out back to a life of crime, showing up back in prison. We want to minimize that. So they started an educational program in the prisons to help people change their lifestyle so that when they go back out in the real world, they have new habits and new tools and strategies for dealing with challenges. And Novartis said, wait a minute, we need that too. We don't want people to leave the hospital and then go back into the real world and continue with their bad eating and bad exercise and the same problems that brought them to the hospital to begin with. So we need to educate our patients. And Novartis developed an educational program that could be delivered right there while the patient was still in the hospital. And they said they would not have thought about going down that avenue if they had not met with the prison warden. So fascinating what can happen. So I'm going to break you now up for about 3 or 4 minutes. Those of you who are in teams or in a group with others, turn to the few people around you. Those of you who are alone in your office, a little quiet reflection. Think about a challenge that your team has. And what attribute do you need to improve? Who on this planet is already terrific at that? And that could potentially be an interesting visit. So take a few moments to either discuss or reflect on that question, and then we'll come back and maybe somebody can share an idea about who you could go visit. right. Okay, we're going to come back. And I know I only gave you just a few moments to think about it. This is something that might take a little more depth of conversation. You can do that a little later, but are there any thoughts around this at this point? Did anybody have any revelation of a possible visit that came from your conversation that you could share with all of us?
If you have something to share, you can.
Yeah, just unmute
your
yourself.
mic.
Somebody was about to start?
Yeah, Dr. Harish, this is Srini from India. I actually have one observation. Actually, at Logitech, we have a lot of inventory that we maintain at our warehouses. And our supply chain operations take some time actually for shipping through the water. I mean, on the waters. Especially if it has to cross country. So I just want to find out how IKEA does it. IKEA is the biggest company that does that's very good at logistics and their supply chain operations.
Yeah.
And they are very successful at any product that needs to be delivered to the retail customers. They are very good at it. So
yeah.
That's another thing that's something that actually I want to see if we can approach them and if we can find out their trade secrets or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, again, as I say, it's really remarkable how open the non-competitive space will be. They really are open, and you know somebody who knows somebody at IKEA. It can happen. Somebody at Logitech knows somebody at IKEA. I'd say there's a guarantee on that one. And IKEA is just but one example. One that came to mind as you were talking, I think we talked about this in one of our earlier sessions today, is the fashion retailer Zara in Europe. Most fashion retailers take 9 months to move from design to inventory to getting it on the shelf. Zara can do it in a week. From design to product on the shelf, they can do it in 1 week. So something is different in how they operate. And maybe a visit to a company like that could be very effective as well. A lot of interesting lessons to learn from that. Interesting. Anybody else have one you want to... Or maybe you have an attribute you want to improve and the whole group can help you think of something.
Yeah, Priyank from India. About from last couple of quarters or 3 quarters, I must say, we are going through a brand transition, the way we want people to look at us. But when I go outside, I don't see that thing trickling down to the consumers or at the customer level. So that's a challenge that we face here. And an ideal scenario would be any of the telecom giants in India. So be it Airtel, that has gone through brand transition 4 times since its inception. Or for that matter, Vodafone, which has already gone one of the transitions when it took over one of the telecom giants in India. So a visit to one of these companies would definitely help us to look at the transition and handle it.
Excellent idea. A company that has already solved that problem and is not in your competitive space, and they even did it in India. So many lessons to be learned. Great ideas. So keep thinking. As I say, this might take a little bit more conversation with each other to think about who could those companies be. But once you go on these visits, you don't want to stop. They're fun and they're very intriguing. So the first thing is to think about who you could visit. Now, the visits are not just about other companies. Another very important component of visiting the future is to go and live in the world of your customer. We make so many assumptions about who our customer is and how they use our products and what they consider to be of value. We do focus groups where we're asking them questions, but many times people can't report. They don't remember. They're not giving you accurate information. And what innovative companies will do is they will go and visit the world of the customer, and they will watch the customer interacting, making decisions, using the product. So as an example, Procter & Gamble here in the United States, they make laundry equipment, and you'd think there's nothing much left to learn about doing laundry. I mean, we pretty much know the process. But they still think there's always something to learn. So they went into laundromats to watch people as they did laundry. And a couple of years ago, they saw something that had never surfaced before. They hadn't noticed before. It turns out when people go into a laundromat, when they open a machine, they make a face and then they'll close it. And they'll open a few washing machines before they'll pick one to put their own laundry into. This is, of course, for the self-service laundromats I'm talking about. And so they thought, that's curious behavior. What's going on? Well, it turns out people don't want to put their own dirty clothes into a machine that's just been used by some total stranger. And so they recognized, Procter & Gamble recognized that as a pain point, and they could perhaps solve that pain for the customer. They created a product of sheets that could sanitize the inside of the machine before you use it. A little throwaway disposable sheet that the customer could use to clean the inside of the machine before putting their own clothes inside. And that created great value for the company. So think about not only visiting other companies, but visiting the world of your own customer to see how they make decisions about products, how they actually use the products, what actually matters to them. Now, beyond visiting the future, let's move to the second way to bring the future to the present. We can partner with the future, not just visit, but actually partner. And partnering may help us gain access to the non-customer. What do I mean by that? Give you an example. The car company Acura did a little data mining on people in the United States who buy their automobile. And they discovered an interesting trend that people who buy an Acura, when they travel, they like to stay at the W hotel chain. And in the beginning they thought, well, is that relevant? Is that useful? And then it struck them that if their customers like to stay at the W hotel chain, maybe there are a lot of people who stay at the W hotel chain that don't even know that the car company Acura exists. And that could be a great target of consumer to try and access. But they don't have access to those people. But who does? The W hotel chain. So they went to the headquarters of W and they said, we'd like to create a partnership with you. And here's what we want to do. We want to become your ground travel choice for your guests. If your guest has to travel within a 3 to 5 mile radius, we want you to call our dealerships and we will come to pick up your customers, your guests, free of charge. This will not cost anybody anything. So it's a free basic limo service. And so here's what would happen. If you're a guest at the W, and let's say you need to get to a restaurant, the concierge will call the dealership. Who comes to pick you up? The sales guy comes in a brand new car to pick you up. When you get in the car, you're basically a hostage for the next few miles. And if a conversation gets started with the driver, they may tell you about the program and about the car. If you're staying at the hotel and you are actually interested in the car, they will leave you the keys. And you can drive the car until you check out of the hotel, drive it around town for a few days and see how it feels. Just leave the keys with the concierge when you are done. They will not reveal how many new Acura owners they have developed from this program, but they have said it's been remarkably effective at turning these chauffeured guests into later car owners. So notice, Acura doesn't have access to this non-customer, but the W hotel chain does. And there are stories galore of companies that have done this, have 1 degree of separation away from the customer so they find somebody who is just a little bit closer to that future. An example, other than Acura, is a medical device company. I was working with a medical device company that makes equipment for physicians who have a private practice. This is equipment that any physician who has a private practice would need in their office. And their concern was that they have competition. And once the physician opens the office and starts shopping for equipment, they're going to go to a bunch of companies. So they were thinking, can we get access to these physicians before anybody else? Well, who has access to these doctors? And it occurred to them that commercial leasing, real estate companies would have access to those people. So when these physicians begin looking for office space, they connect with a commercial real estate leasing office. And those leasing agents would know who those physicians are who are looking to open a practice. And so they made a partnership with those leasing real estate agents that as you are showing property, you could also kind of bundle the property with equipment and kind of create a package for physicians with a good deal. I was telling the groups this morning that something just happened to me, a third story, just happened to me a few days ago in my email box. I am a frequent flyer with American Airlines. And Uber, the ride company, just now got permission here in the United States to pick people up from airports. Up until now, we're not allowed to pick people up from airports. Well, Uber would like now people who land from an airplane to call them to get picked up. But Uber doesn't know who these people are. But who does know who these people are? The airlines. So they made a deal apparently with American Airlines because I got an email from American Airlines. And the email said, you're a frequent flyer with American Airlines and we would like to offer you a deal with Uber for Uber to be able to pick you up at any airport you come to. So Uber is partnering with American Airlines to get to me, which I think is fascinating because look at the deal here. I trust American Airlines. I fly with them a lot. I don't know Uber yet. I've never used them. So I don't really have a strong trust relationship, but if American does, if American Airlines trusts them and I trust American Airlines, then I'm more willing to be their customer. So these partnerships can be very effective and companies that partner with others find market share growing quite nicely. Now, partnering isn't just with other companies to get more customers. You can also partner for your next big idea. Where is your next breakthrough product, breakthrough idea, breakthrough service going to come from? Partnering may be the answer or part of your strategy to get to that idea. For example, who are some companies that partner for ideas? I would offer you that Apple actually is a great example of a company that partners in this respect. And you might say, Apple? Apple is so secretive. They keep all their products secret. Nobody's allowed to know about them before they launch. And you're right. But let's think about it. Once a product launches, once the phone is out, who develops the apps for the Apple products? And the answer is the customers. Any user, anybody can develop an app for a product and be compensated by Apple. So Apple is partnering with their users to create more value in the product, which is fascinating. In fact, I just saw the 2015 financials, and to the end of 2015, Apple has paid out more than 30 billion, that's with a B, 30 billion US dollars to all of us who have developed apps for their phones and other devices. So that's an interesting partnership. How could your users help you create more value for them? That's an interesting partnership. There are other such examples. Procter & Gamble, company I made reference to earlier, they have a program and they call it Connect and Develop. Part of their corporate strategy is that they want 50% or more, a minimum of 50% of products to come from partnerships. And so it means they have to be very transparent about what they're working on. But these days, companies are becoming more transparent because they realize you can't keep a secret anyway. And so Procter & Gamble partners, Siemens in Europe, go to the Siemens website. They have an e-magazine that they call Pictures of the Future. They put it out once every 6 months. And the pictures are little icons about what they're trying to develop and invent for the future. Ideas. You click on any one of those, They're looking for partnerships to help them develop this idea. So companies out there are saying we don't have to invent everything ourselves. We can create a lot more value if we partner with others for that next big idea. So one of the questions I want you to be thinking about is, with whom could you partner to get either access to your future customer or to get your next big idea? How could you deploy the Acura idea? How could you do what Acura is doing to either get to customers or to get to ideas? So with whom can you partner? So that's the second thing. We've talked about visiting the future, and we've talked about partnering with the future. Now, the third way of bringing the future to the present, and it has to do with action. We tend to do things in a sequential order. First things first, last things last. We go in order, we have milestones. And I want you to question the assumption of the order in which you do things. It may be in your best interest to better shape the future, to reverse the order of things, to take actions that you normally do late and do them much earlier. So I'll give you an example from budgeting and how, when you set budgets, what just changing the action and the order of them can do. This is a story of a scientist who was working for NASA. And he was working for a research arm of NASA called JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. JPL is in Pasadena, California, and they build the hardware that NASA sends into space. This man was in charge of the program that was developing the first rover that was going to go to Mars. Talk about cutting edge science. I mean, the big breakthrough idea. Wow. Well, when he came to an executive program that I was conducting, he was so frustrated, he was ready to quit his job. And we asked him, you are doing the coolest science on the earth. Why would you want to quit? And here's what he explained. He said, I have 5 teams, and these 5 teams are each in charge of a different part of the rover. At the beginning of the fiscal year, we get the budget from NASA, which it's government money, it's very transparent, and each team has to advocate for how much money they are going to need. But he said, I keep 15%, 15% of the budget I put aside in case there are problems, which inevitably there are going to be. With new science, you don't know what you're going to run into. So I have money to solve those problems. Well, then what happens? He said, what happens is that throughout the year, every time a team has a problem, they come begging me for money, and they're trying to get as much of the money as they can. And I am spending inordinate amounts of time listening to these teams beg and cry for money. By the end of the year, I've given away all the money, and now I have to start the whole thing over again. So he said, I signed up for this project for the science, and it's turned into one long fight about money. So if I can't solve this problem, I don't want this job anymore. Well, the class at UCLA said to him, why don't you bring the future to the present? If you're telling us that by the end of the year you've given away all the money, why don't you just do that from day one? Give away all the money. Don't have any contingency, then they can't come begging you for money. You've solved your problem. And he almost fell out of his chair. He said, I can't do that. Because think about it. What if a team suddenly has a problem and they need $100,000 to solve the problem? And it's a legitimate request. I mean, it was a problem that could not be anticipated. So think about it. If he doesn't have the money, where could that team go for money? The other teams. Now, if your team needed $100,000 and you went to the other rover teams to ask for money, are they going to be very quick to give you the money? Maybe not. But they're definitely going to want to know what the problem is. Because if they let you fail, what's going to happen to them? They fail. The only way for a team to be successful is if all the teams are successful. That's the only way this rover is going to Mars. So because it would be in their best interest to help each other, he didn't have to force them to be good to each other. It was in their selfish best interest to be helpful to each other. He was willing to try this for 1 year, give away all the money and not have any contingency. And he came back to later classes to say what happened. And it was dramatic. He said it was unbelievable. Suddenly, if a team had a problem, it wasn't those 10 members just thinking how to get the money. It was 50 brains thinking how to solve the problem, which is a very different question. And because so many diverse thinkers were all working on each problem, the solutions were just incredibly creative. And so this project actually was successfully completed under budget. Probably a NASA first. And he credits it to having changed the dynamic amongst the teams. He also shared something very interesting about the design of that first rover. And I want to share with you what he told us, because it's a very interesting story about where good ideas come from. How do you come up with good ideas? You can't just lock yourself in a room and say, okay, be creative. In the next hour, I'm going to have 9 brilliant ideas. Okay, our brains don't work that way. So how do we trigger creative ideas? Let me share with you the story of the rover. You might remember the size. The first rover that went to Mars, we could fit right here on this table. It was very small. How did the engineers dream that up? And the answer is they didn't. It didn't come from the engineers. The first design that the engineers had was something roughly the size of a Jeep. It was a huge automobile-sized thing. And they already had a mock-up set up, designed, and it was parked at the NASA base, which logistically was a 2-hour drive into the desert from JPL. Well, these engineers got word from Washington, D.C. that the senators in charge of NASA appropriations, the money that goes to NASA, these senators wanted to come and see where all the money is going. And that made the engineers very nervous, because if they come and we take them to the desert for 2 hours to look at a piece of metal that's just sitting there, we could potentially lose our funding, because that's not very impressive. So they decided to build a model. I mean, what is a model? It's really a tangible picture of the future. So they built a tabletop model right there at JPL with all the functionality. And then came the day of the visit. The senators come in and they get to see what this rover can do, and the engineers are so pleased with themselves. But the senators are on a very tight schedule. They have to leave within 10 minutes. So they are impressed and they are congratulating the engineers on their brilliance. They're now standing at the door and they stop. And they turn to the engineers and they say, "We just want to reiterate how impressed we are. We had no idea what we were about to see. We cannot believe that this thing is going to Mars. I mean, it looks like a toy a child could play with. It is hard to believe that that can go and do all the science you were talking about. You know what? We will champion your cause in Washington. We want to see it happen." And they're out the door. The engineers almost died. They were hyperventilating. They couldn't catch their breath. How did we let that happen? Those idiots think that this toy is going to Mars. How could they be so stupid? How could we be so stupid? How could we have misled them this way? For 20 minutes they went on just thinking how to correct what had just happened here. But then one of them calmed down a little bit and said, "You know, it's an interesting idea. What if it were to be that size?" What did all the other engineers in the room say? "No, it can't be." And they pointed out all the problems with it, which it had problems. But he persisted and he said, "You know, we can always dismiss the idea later, but let's at least explore it down and drive it down. Let's really think about it." And the more they calmed down and the more they explored the possibility, they actually realized it solved some of the problems they were having with the Jeep in the desert. And that ended up being the size of the rover. And where did the idea come from? From somebody who just didn't understand what he was talking about. And how often are we guilty of what almost happened here? we dismiss an idea, not on its merit, but on its source, right? From where it came from, not necessarily on the value of the idea. So we think we're open-minded, but there are limitations to how open-minded we are. So just be thinking to be more open, no matter where the source of the idea comes from. So, by the way, just coming back for a moment to the idea of a prototype and the model as a picture of the future, I just 2 days ago was reading a book on innovation, and they had a story about the very first mouse, computer mouse. I thought, I'm coming to Logitech, I gotta tell you the story. So it turns out that Steve Jobs went to visit Xerox, and he saw the very first mouse that Xerox was working on. And he learned that just the parts alone cost more than $400. And he thought, it's a very cool tool, but we can't have something that costs $400 just in parts. So he left and he thought, I want a mouse that can cost $25. And he went to a design team at Stanford University. Two guys who were working together. And he said, can you design me a mouse? And he explained the functionality with parts off the shelf. Can you design something that would be cheap, $25 total, with parts off the shelf? And so these two guys took the challenge. And what did they do? They went to a drugstore, Walgreens here in the United States. And they just looked at products to think, are there any products here that we could pull together to shape a mouse? And when they got to the deodorant aisle, they had their answer. They opened one of the deodorant containers, and it was Ban Roll-On. It was the kind of deodorant that has that ball inside that rotates, so that when you're rolling it on, you can get the deodorant on your skin and the ball is moving. And they bought the entire shelf of product and brought it back to Stanford to play with that ball that can rotate and move, and that actually became part of the first prototype of the mouse. When you lift that mouse, it actually said Ban Roll-On deodorant in that prototype, and that was evidence enough to Steve Jobs that a mouse could be built for a fraction of the Xerox price. So thought that was an interesting example of going back to creating a tangible picture of the future with a prototype. Coming back to our budget crisis here, what did this guy do? Really something very simple. He said, instead of giving all the money away by the end of the year, let me do it at the beginning of the year. What action can I take earlier? As simple as that sounds, the Dell Computer Company actually got a patent on this methodology of bringing the future to the present. What did Dell do? Here's what they got a patent on. Before Dell, you built your product, a computer, you put it on a shelf, and the customer came to buy it. So first you build it, and then they come to buy it. And Dell reversed the process. First with Dell, the customer calls in the order and pays for it, and then Dell builds the product. And that was so revolutionary from the patent office point of view that they were awarded a patent on that. So it is quite remarkable how lucrative bringing the future to the present can be. So I'll give you one more car example. Since we talked about the Acura car company, I'll share with you a car company that took action earlier rather than later. Also something I want you to be, again, thinking how you could apply this to your products and your customer experience with your products. Car dealers want you to come back and buy the next year's model, right? You're driving a particular brand of a car. They want you to want to buy their car again. So what's the typical car buying process? You go to a dealership, you're going to buy the new car, and then a few years later, you might think about buying a new car, and that's when you go starting to test drive cars. Well, what Lexus did is they said, that's too late. If we wait for customers to want to test drive new cars, they may drive a whole host of different brands. So here's what Lexus does. If you buy a Lexus, after a year, you have to come and have the car serviced. By the way, they'll service your car free of charge. While they're servicing your car, they will give you a loaner car that's a brand new model of a Lexus to drive around while your car is being taken care of. So you now have the experience of all the upgrades and feeling what this new car feels like. And what happens, it turns out, that by doing this, they get their car owners to be very loyal to the brand and also to want to get the next car much sooner than a lot of other car owners might want to do so. Why? Because they're giving people the experience of driving that car much earlier than they otherwise would want to test drive a car. So I want you to think about what kind of actions you could take earlier rather than later. And one specific action I want you to think about has to do with when you acknowledge and celebrate your projects. So most companies, when we're working on a project, we work, and finally we succeed and we celebrate the outcome. We tend to just celebrate the outcome of a project. And what I would offer you is that for the human experience, that's not enough. We humans need to feel a sense of progress and to acknowledge and celebrate progress much more frequently than just the outcome of the final project. What could you be doing to celebrate the process of getting to the outcome? What could you be doing to celebrate the people who are helping us get to that outcome so that you can amplify the positive behaviors you're looking for? And the reason I suggest this is that the human mind needs to feel like progress is being made. And if you have a project that the outcome won't be for another year or 18 months or maybe even 5 years, that is so far out in the future, people don't have a good grasp of that. So, excuse me, the question is, how can you celebrate more frequently the kinds of behaviors we're looking to see more of? Just to show you what the progress principle is, that you are as prone to this progress principle as anybody else, this need to see progress. If you get on a website that doesn't pop up right away, you're gone, right? You don't have patience for that. Unless there's a progress bar, right? If there's a progress bar on that website that shows that something's happening, or a circle that's slowly filling up, you are willing to stick with that a little bit longer than you otherwise might, because you can sense that progress is being made. So even in the span of a few seconds, we need to feel that progress is being made. Think about work on projects. Think about your career. We all want to feel like we are making progress, that we are growing, that we are moving. And if we don't get that sense from our peers, from our leaders, we tend to get a little less engaged in the project, a little less engaged at work. So for helping a team stay engaged, we have to acknowledge the contributions people are making. So this does take some creativity on your part. How do you celebrate people? How do you celebrate process? It has to be authentic. It has to be personal. It has to be real. You don't want to do what a defense company I worked with decided to do. Here's what this defense company decided to do. They decided that, yes, they wanted to recognize people on a weekly basis. So they had their managers send out an email every Friday at 5 o'clock, same time, same day, same every week. And the managers were given a template. Here's what you need to send out. It said 2 sentences. Dear team member, thank you for your contribution to our efforts this week. We appreciate you. That was it. Can you imagine getting that email every Friday at 5 o'clock and everybody's getting exactly the same email? Do you feel appreciated? It actually achieved the opposite of what they intended. People got disgusted by it. It was like they were just checking off the box of, okay, I have to say thank you, so let me do it in a mass email to dear anybody, we appreciate you. So you got to be thinking carefully how we acknowledge and how we celebrate. And I have much more on this in a book I just finished writing that came out a few months ago called Extraordinary Outcomes. One of the whole chapters is dedicated to how do we get to extraordinary outcomes is by amplifying the positive behaviors of our team members. And Ellie and Jessica are going to find a way to make copies of that book accessible to you, should any of you want to see what's in
if you want
there.
a copy, you can email logilearner@logitech.com.
Okay, so if you email Logi Learner, they'll find a way to get you an access to the book. In any case, I just want you to think about how you can celebrate those small wins. And finally, last but not least, one more interesting way to bring the future to the present. And it has to do with post-mortems on our projects. Ellie, do you think maybe you could ask them? I don't know if that noise is that. Hold on one second, because there's a very strong noise right outside the door here. I don't want it to interfere with this. Ellie will just see if she can shut it off. When we do our projects, we tend to do what we call a post-mortem, right? Post-mortem means after death. And so after the project is done, we want to do lessons learned, successes, failures. What did we learn from this project? Raise your hand if you've done a post-mortem so we can just see. Okay, sizable number of people have done these kinds of lessons learned after a project. Well, unfortunately, that's a little late, because if the project failed, it doesn't help that particular project, right? This is more like an autopsy for this failed thing. And so I want to share with you how you can bring the future to the present, even with the post-mortem lessons. Instead of, or perhaps in addition to the post-mortem, you conduct a pre-mortem. And a pre-mortem means before death. And here's what it looks like. You take your project plan. Let's just say this is the project plan. And you want to review it before you execute it. Now, there are two possible ways to review it. One way, the bad way, is to say, okay, team, here's the plan. Do you see any problem with it? What you're asking people to do is look at the plan and project it into the future to see if they can identify potential challenges. That's really hard for the human mind to do. We have a hard time peering into the future. So here's a way to get a lot more value from this pre-mortem. You say, people, here's the plan. I bought a crystal ball. Did you know that Coke now makes crystal balls? Anyway, I bought a crystal ball, and this crystal ball tells me the future. It tells me the plan failed. I know the plan failed. The problem is, it's a cheap aluminum crystal ball. It doesn't know why the plan failed. That's our job. We have to figure out why this plan failed. And so what you're asking people to do is, in their imagination, jump into the future, imagine the plan has failed, and now look back in time to figure out why it failed. And it is amazing how many more errors you are going to discover when you ask people to engage their mind this way. And what's dramatic is that people know it's a game and it's effective anyway. It's just deploying our mind instead of looking forward, using hindsight by trying to figure out how we got here. And the two kinds of errors you will find that you will get a lot more of are errors of commission, things here that shouldn't be, and errors of omission, things that are missing. And the beauty is you haven't executed your plan yet, so it's an opportunity to make the plan more robust. So with that, we have covered essentially 3.5 ways to bring the future to the present. We've talked about visiting the future. How can you visit other companies or the world of your customer? That's a question you can discuss with your team. How could you partner with the future? So who is 1 degree of separation closer to the future than you are? Maybe access to the non-customer or access to an idea. And now we've talked about actions. What action could you take that normally you do later, but would help you reduce uncertainty if you did it earlier in the process rather than later? So what would that action be? And actually, the pre-mortem is also an action item. It's taking that action of a post-mortem and doing it before executing the plan, not just after executing the plan. So with that, we have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we have a few moments for any questions or comments anybody wants to raise. If anybody would like to raise any type of question, we have an opportunity for that now. What I will offer you, I'll share with you one question that came up this morning. And the question that came up this morning was, where do we start? Where do we start? And my answer is with something as small as possible. What's the smallest change, the smallest little thing you could try that wouldn't take a lot of resources, it wouldn't take a lot of time, wouldn't require all of Logitech to be involved? What's a small experiment you could do around these ideas that might get the ball rolling? That's where you start. So if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and come online. I heard an but that was the last we heard. Okay, well, if not, I will. This is just the beginning. You are going to get, in addition to the handout that you have, an updated version of this handout with a few more targeted questions for you to think about that will help trigger some of your thinking as well as conversation with your teams around these concepts. So with that, I want to thank you for spending our third session together with me, and go out and be a positive deviant. So thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.